from Breathing Research Group. Today, Elle and I are just going to go over some lessons that we thought we learned from sitting on the MRFF Grant Assessment Committee. And we were specifically on the chronic respiratory conditions round, which makes sense, obviously. And I thought particularly there was things about the consumer input part that had surprised me. I thought that had changed from the previous year when it applied like grade and everyone knew about that, yeah. And so all I'm going to do at the start is just provide an overview of like what the assessment process looks like. So happy for like just for it to be casual and just jump in any questions that you have. And then I'll hand over to Ella to provide more detail about how to best put forward an application that has good consumer representation. So this is very just, point by point factually what we did. So the first step importantly is the grant assessment committee is of course asked to declare their conflicts of interest. And so this is any personal or professional or financial conflicts. And it's, it was defined as are you on a successful grant for someone, do you have qualifications, etc. And these were actually really readdressed each time we spoke about a grant. And then you also, which was thankful for me, you completed a suitability assessment. So you rated how confident you were with that specific grant. So the chronic respiratory disease round, and so there's different themes in those rounds. Some of them are in pediatrics or basic science. And for those, I said that I have low or limited knowledge in the area. And then I felt like the grants that were allocated to me were pretty much in my area. There was none that I was like really unsure about. So before you assess any of the grants, you meet with the panel and the NHMRC and they give you a presentation and they just provide a summary firstly of how many grants were received. So for the 2024 round that's getting evaluated now, there were 50 in the chronic respiratory disease round across the different 3 streams, or about, I think it was low 50s. And then they provide you an overview of the assessment process and highlight any key changes from previous years. So something that I'll talk about, we can discuss if it's of interest, is there really was a lot of assessment on how well the grant aligned to the stream. So sometimes the wording of the specific streams and the opportunity could be perceived as a bit vague, and that was feedback back to the NHMRC, and you might think, oh, I think I can work this into that stream. But if you get your grant back and you see that the impact is low, that was probably one of the #1 reasons of why it was low, is because the committee felt that it was kind of trying to push something into that stream that didn't really fit. So this is the assessment criteria. I appreciate that that's probably small. And there's different things that you're assessing on, of course. There's a project impact, which is 40%. The methodology, which is 30%, capacity, capability and resources to deliver, which is 30%, and then there's overall value and risk of the project, and I'll go into that more now, but later, but what's important to note is that you'll see that the consumer involvement statement that you have to provide out comes into the rating of every single section, and this was really apparent when it was discussed how much emphasis people put on that consumer involvement statement. So then to me, and I know some of the good applications did this and I will elaborate on that, but given there's so much emphasis on consumer involvement and that's like Elle's an expert in how to involve consumers in research. So why don't we have someone like Elle as a CI on the grant, just like you would have a statistician or a health economist? Yes. Like, that would help actually genuinely do that aspect of the grant.
And sorry, can I just cut in and ask, what about actual consumers as CIs? Do you think that's important too?
Yeah, that was, I think you touched on that, Elle, but there were some really good grants that have like warm established relationships. Well, that's what they said. And the consumer was given a CI spot. Yeah. So there was, I think it was obvious that, you can obviously comment on that, where it was like, oh, we just found someone who had asthma and like slotted them on. Yeah. But the ones who did it well, it was like, they were involved and they've been published with that consumer before. Yeah, right. I think the most I saw was 2 consumers at CI.
Yes.
Yeah. So the key changes, these are my notes that I thought had changed from when I had applied, is in the capacity and capability section, they no longer ask you for your top 5 hubs of the CIs. And so the focus on this section was much more about the below points. So they really value diverse skills and expertise across the requirements of the grant. So like one that I assessed, and I felt that this came back to the discussion, was if it's in like rural, asthma, women, the pregnancy, for example, there was kind of an expert that was a rural expert. And, you know, so they really were bringing together people who had specific expertise in each of the domains and bringing them together and really highlighted how that would work, you know, how the team would work in that way. And, you know, there was one, without getting somewhere, I guess, but there was one that had like 5 different disease groups that they were kind of bringing together for the same aim, and they clearly had like a lead researcher for each of those disease groups, and that was like the governance structure. Another comment that came up was, you know, you have the priority population, so you might say one of the priority populations is diseases of aging, and we can kind of fit COPD or asthma or whatever into that. But obviously you really had to have leadership and showing leadership in that priority population. So a different example might be if you're doing Indigenous research, it had to be very clear that you actually have demonstrated leadership in Indigenous research or rural health, for example. You couldn't just say, you know, you published one paper in that area. You had to actually show that you were the team for that priority population. And yeah, the capacity and capability rather than publications was more about how your research has previously influenced policy or practice. So it was more, rather than just like listing, you know, hubs and saying the impact of those specific hubs, it was more of a broader picture idea of where your program of research has had an impact. Something that I obviously liked as an ENCR is that the community really did value capacity building. So there was a couple where there was a very early career researcher as the CIA, and we kind of discussed, is that a pro or a con? And the overwhelming response was, that's definitely a pro, especially if it's highlighted how there's like mentorship and support of that researcher. Yeah, like I don't remember anyone trying to argue against that point that was valued. And they also value non-academic research partners. I don't remember this overall risk rating from previous years, that might not be new, but in addition to like the standard impact methodology and capacity of the team, they were all rated on like a traditional rubric, but then we had to rate the overall value of risk as either low, moderate or excellent. And the overall rating that each grant got was the most common across the entire committee. So say there's 20 people on the committee, it was just a frequency of, yeah, which of those low, moderate or excellent was the most common. And this was meant to be about making sure that if something is funded, it's an ethical and efficient use of that investment, even if it's a good quality study and it's, you know, you've designed it in the most excellent way. If it's not a good quality investment, that would obviously impact the funding. So what we were told would come into this would be the measures of success statement, the budget and your risk management plan. But what I did really find is people were using heavily the consumer involvement to sway their risk between categories. So, you know, you wouldn't get excellent unless you had good consumer involvement in your project. Something that we went round and round and round about, and I hope this is the actual interpretation. But from my perspective, what NHMRC was saying is that a grant with an excellent overall value and risk, but a lower overall rating will be prioritised for funding over a project that has a higher rating, but only a good overall value and risk. So it's not just the number that you get from those first 3 sections, it's, this overall value and risk really comes into play. So you probably can't see that table, but it's just going through that and I'll go over this in the next few slides, but there's different spokespersons allocated to each grant. So you're allocated grants as either spokesperson 1, 2, or 3. Spokesperson 1 or 2 will speak at the meeting, and 3 is just kind of there for a backup, and then everyone on the committee is meant to read all grants. So when you're actually at the assessment meeting, I'm just going to go through the flow of what happens. And the keynote is how quickly this whole process happens. And they designed it this way because the NHMRC felt that the longer you discussed a grant, the more holes you found in that grant, and the rating just gets lower and lower. So they try and make people make decisions quickly. So the chair will announce what the grant is and confirm again with those on the committee that there's no conflicts of interest or no conflicts. Spokesperson 1 has 5 minutes to discuss the grant. So a broad overview of their opinion of the strengths and weaknesses, and then they'll verbalise their score in each of the categories. Spokesperson 2 has 3 minutes to add anything else, and they're really just meant to discuss anything that spokesperson 1 hasn't said or that they might disagree with spokesperson 1 and verbalise their score. Spokesperson 1 and 2 should have scores within 2 of each other, or they were asked to justify why their scores were outside of 2. And I'll speak to that, this was an interesting point to me, but I'll just cover that in the next couple of slides. And then the consumer expert, so Elle, or there was another lady, Anne, had 5 minutes to speak. And then the whole committee only had 5 minutes to discuss everything that they had heard. So you've already rated it, especially if you're spokesperson 1, 2, or 3. So then as this is happening, I'm kind of in my head deciding, do I change my scores based on anything that's being presented? The chair will ask all committee members if they have a score more than 2 away from the first spokesperson, and they had to say why. And then if not, all final scores are inputted, and then the score is the average of the whole committee for each section. At the end of each day, we were given a chance to revisit any of the grants, or if we thought, you know, on reflection, something was unfair, or we disagreed with the scores, then we were able to bring that up. But none of the days that I was involved in did anyone bring anything up. So this slide is just my final slide, I think, on just observations. Very few grants received an overall score of 6 or more. It kind of seemed like a really good grant was a 5 point something, like 5.6. So this was even if the discussion was overwhelmingly positive. When they gave us the final score, it would be like 5.8. I was like, how is that a 5.8 when like everyone was so positive? So to me, that says if you get your score back and it's in the 5s, you might think, why wasn't it higher? But don't be like, like down by that, because that actually was a very good score. And very few grants also received an overall risk rating of excellent. So most of the good grants had a good overall risk rating and were a high 5. So like I said before, a grant was rated low for impact, so less than 4, often the score went down to, if it was not thought to align well with the stream objectives. So there were a couple where, you know, it's super obvious for some, but then when it's not super obvious, that was a main talking point of the discussion about whether we should reduce the score for impact based on that one point. Another interesting thing is that the committee members are asked to justify their ratings against those criteria that we've given for like impact methods and capability. But this was often not well done. I kind of felt like, you know, the spokesperson one would say, I give 6 for impact. And then the chair would be like, is anyone 2 away for that? Someone might be like, I'm giving a 4. And then the chair would be like, why? And the reason for why, I was like, well, that's not reflective of the criteria. You're just kind of saying your actual opinion of the study. So, and that was never like, the chair then never, you know, you just say your reason why and then that's recorded and then they move on. So then I think I say that just to also not be disheartened. Don't place too much emphasis on the score based on the quality of your work. If, you know, it's all subjective as we know, and you could just get a bad spokesperson for your grant that has some personal hate of pulmonary function testing, for example, and then, you know, that, and then that really just impacts the overall score. So, you know, you can try again and you can get a completely different rating even if you keep the same quality. Or the same project design, I should say. The other thing I noticed was how quickly people were willing to change their rating in the moment based on this discussion. So you might go in there thinking this is a 666, and then 5 minutes of discussion that changes it to like a 444. And this was particularly after the consumer person spoke. So that consumer person seemed to have a lot of weight in those final scores, and that people were very easy to like put them down if the consumer person says that these are the gaps in consumer involvement. And the other thing which was disappointing for me is that some of the committee members seemed to let their score in one section influence all their scores. So they wouldn't just think about the sections in isolation, and we might have a discussion about some of the methodology of one project. And then some of the committee members would then be like, oh, okay, well, instead of just docking a mark from the methodology in line with this rubric, I'm going to take marks from the whole thing. Even the capability section, it would. I got into an argument with someone because shocking. They wanted to reduce the score for the team, and I honestly couldn't find anything wrong with the team. So I was like, well, what's wrong with it? Like, they have good governance, they have an expert in each section, and that person they had no real reason for docking marks for the capability. They were just impacted. They just had this thing in their mind about how they didn't do something in the methods, for example. And it's like, well, you've got to rate them in isolation. So I think too, if you get a score back on the capacity and capability of the team, for example, that's low, and you're like, we have a brilliant team, I don't know how to improve this, could just be that it's been rated, you know, the other sections actually, the rating of those is influenced the rating of the sections. That's all that I have. If I was going to go more into the consumer section. Does anyone have any questions on the general process?
So it's definitely average, not median scores.
Yeah, my interpretation was average. Yeah.
I was just on a small grant panel the other day and they chose to put medians.
Yeah.
So I was just curious.
I think because there was so much discussion around whether you were too away.
Because they'd already sort of narrowed it in.
But if you're choosing meetings, it implies a substantial scale of difference in scoring, where a meeting is a better representation of the meeting.
I guess the meeting takes into account any like broken outliers.
The panel chose, or the chair chose not to address outliers, but just take median instead. So yeah, just curious.
Yeah.
And then not invite the outliers back.
Well, I don't know, yeah. There were a lot of markers per grant as well.
With scores so narrow, you know, so a lot of people are going to be sitting around the same landing.
Yeah.
I'm a little surprised that there's so much subjective changeability to scoring.
Yeah.
When there's been a detailed review period and then a
Yes.
spotlight period that's very minimum, 5 minutes. So you spent hours reading
Yes.
through substantial trove of documentation.
Yeah.
You've assessed that in time, and then they said, why is it 2 hours? And then people go, all right, I'll go halfway down the score that I did before.
Yeah.
So they're all in the same.
But that's why I got into the 5 with this one grant, because I was like, I've spent hours reading this and trying to critique it against the criteria, and then this one guy was just like, no, I don't like it. I'm like, well, you have to say why. Like,
It was a that was rude.
yeah.
And how long do you have to read the?
You're given like quite a few weeks, I can't remember, maybe a month, 2 months to read the, and I tried to spend about 2 hours per grant.
So do you always receive all the grades that they apply for that area?
Yeah, so you can see, you know, there was 50 across all streams, and the initial assessment is that based on your suitability rating and your conflicts, you're allocated just a section. So I only had like 8 or 9, and then so I only saw those 8 or 9, and I imagine everyone else on the committee had the same number or similar numbers. But then when it goes to the whole committee meeting, about a month before, they let you see all of them that are at that committee meeting. So you can at least familiarise yourself with what will be discussed, but you don't read those details. So that's where you're like, I read 8 or 9 in detail, but then there was like 30 others by the time we got to the meeting that you are kind of relying on the spokesperson's opinion because you haven't had 2 hours to read, no one has that much
And
time.
you also have to score those that you haven't read.
Yes, yeah, so you're gonna like read them, but you're not reading them in detail, and then you're scoring them in the moment at the committee meeting, not prior. Yeah.
With the CIA position, after doing this, who is the best person to position in CIA?
I guess there are 2 different approaches. When, I remember there was one grant where there was a really high, like esteemed professor or something as the CIA. And then when you do the capability and capacity thing, then they've listed all the grants they're involved in and all the stuff they're involved in. And it actually came up and be like, is this person even gonna have time to manage this study? And then we kind of decided, well, it's not on us to decide that. Maybe it influenced the overall risk a little bit, but if they're the CIA, then that's it. So there's that, I guess, end of the spectrum. But then, like I said, if it was the other way, and there was I think the early career researcher was like as a fresh out of PhD basically, and they had just well described the governance of how that study would run and support that, and that was seen favourably. So I think having the most experienced esteemed person at CIA isn't necessarily gonna get you the grant. Yeah, you have to have the whole team governance in place.
And with this round, I think stream 2 was around multiple respiratory conditions.
Yes.
Is that where people were trying to fit a round peg into a square hole or
That
did
was
you
one-
notice that
yes.
happening?
Yes, that was one of the most common things that we discussed. And the NHMRC clarified that multiple just meant 2 or more. And it had to be comorbid conditions. It couldn't be.
Yeah.
There was a few that. Yeah, they were just trying
Like
to.
in aim 1 we'll do asthma and aim 2 we'll do
Exactly,
COPD
yes,
or something.
exactly,
Yeah, right.
yes. And then the other, there was another string. There was something about some of the grants they were trying to make one of the conditions an exacerbation. And I was like, well, no, that's an exacerbation of the primary
Right.
condition, yeah, so it had to be like asthma and BCD, like very clearly comorbid complex conditions, yeah. Right, give Elle the floor. Thank you.
Thanks, Lily, for setting the scene so lovely. So moving on to the consumer involvement lead. So for disclosure, this is my first time sitting in a camp. So I didn't know what to expect at the beginning. So, but then I kind of revised my way out and navigate how to justify my comment on each grant. Okay, all right. So I guess I just want to emphasize this, that consumer involvement has many various positive things as to why I will involve consumer in your research. Consumer has voice, consumers' perspective or their voices, ensure that the research is relevant and practical. They give their experience, lived experiences in the table, hence why involving them is relatively important. And making sure that research actually addresses the kind of research questions that aligns to the what matters most to consumers. So I guess I wouldn't deal so much of this slide because Haley leads some of these tasks. But then particularly for consumer advisors, I just want to emphasize that if you see in a panel, be sure to prepare talking points. Obviously, you just be given less than 5 minutes to go over and to comment about the application. So you just have to be succinct and to go through all the research cycle, to which I'm going through in the next couple of slides. And then, review applications ahead of time, because in my case, I had 18 applications to review, and it was just so overwhelming, to be honest, because just a lot to go through. Yeah, but anyhow, so how do a consumer advisor assess? So well, in my case, well, obviously HMRC would give you the necessary assessment criteria section, which can be found in the relevant MRFF grant opportunity. But also in saying that we are directed to use this document in here. So this is a document or a statement of consumer and community involvement in health and medical research. So what this document is all about is that it contains critical, important details of what consumer role is, how to actively engage consumers in different cycles of research. And in the left, you can see here the research cycle highlighted in this document. So this research cycle actually contains different elements or touch points. So then you can benchmark how to actively engage your consumers throughout the research process. For example, deciding what to research to. So I'm not sure if, sorry if you're not able to contrast, see that being there. But yeah, so deciding what to research to, whether the application has outstandingly express or outline or demonstrate how consumer and community perspectives are being taken into account. For example, if they kind of establish focus groups or research priority setting prior to the conceptualization of the research questions. And then another element of that is that deciding how to do. So were there discussions with consumers and community members all about the methodology and research benefit? And that research cycle about the actual doing of the research. So was there in the grant referring to involving the consumers in the implementation and interpretation of results of the research findings? And then letting people know the results. So was there in the grant specifically stating how consumers are involved in sharing and explaining the research findings? And then last one but not the least, is there in the section or the application that states future research or plan about future research planning informed by consumer perspective. So basically the trajectory of what happens next going forward for future research or unanswered questions. So that's the kind of theme. But in saying that, what consumer advisors actually look for. So unlike Haley's case or other spokesperson, they do have the kind of specific rubric that they go for, say 40% methodology or 30% and so forth. But for consumers advisors, we don't have that kind of rubric as our say how to benchmark. So we're only allowed to say to comment on whether the grant or the application is actually excellent, good, minimal, and we're not allowed to say, well, this application is good as opposed to the second application. We're not allowed to say that. So we're just, and then they've told us that we have to have a fair scrutiny of each application. And so I said, wonder how to do it because there's just too many grants to look into the final details. And I have to check on the methodology at the same time, consumer involvement statement as well. So if it's whether matching or not. And then also I get to look at the budget as well to see if the budget, is speaking about budget allocation for consumer involvement and stuff. But then in my mind, because I didn't know what this kind of, role I have in here, but one thing for sure, I do want to give justice to every application that I read. So I kind of revised this document in here. So what I did was, I've taken that, the research cycle, the one that I showed you there, So I've tabled that out into one, or summarized that in one table. So that means I've got good examples for each research cycle. So I don't need a single thing that each grant is for application is looking about. So in saying, so for example, if I go for, research cycle, deciding what to research, have there been any discussions about with consumers and all that? So I've got it handy. The book the statement, sorry, I just keep thinking, this one is a fair bit to read, it has 25 or 26 pages, so guys, I condensed that for you.
Thank you.
And so when I go through the grant or the application, per se, I just have a table and then mark okay, and then write whether the strength and weaknesses for each applications. So in that way, I could say that, okay, this is an excellent kind of application specifically because da da da, so I can cite the reasons. So that was it. And so what stood out practices as an excellent or I think very good involvement of consumers in some of the applications. So clearly there was a co-design research questions and study design. As I mentioned, most of the grants or some of the grants really did priority setting partnership prior to the conceptualization of the research questions, some of the grant focus groups and all that. And then I can see, or in the grant application, there is consumers being part of the advisor or steering committees. Some of the consumers with lived experience actually nominated or as CI, which is, I think, is really good. It brings their voices in the table. So I thought that was really good. And then most of the, I think if I can remember correctly on top of my head, there were five grants that stood out because they had long kind of established relationship with their consumers. They were really, publishing for, for the last couple of years and all that. And then budget is necessary. So you have to acknowledge about the time and expertise consumers bring into the research. So I would, give thumbs up. And then if there were accessible language and clear communication strategies involved in the applications. And then if they get to say that there would be training provided to both researchers and consumers, I think that's the key. And then lastly, if there is an ongoing reflection and evaluation of consumer involvement in the towards the end. So some quite examples. So this is not directly to the grant that I've kind of reviewed, but yeah, so I thought I'm just gonna show this to you. So so what good looks like, so initiate co-design workshops. So consumers help prioritize research questions, and they also have consumers have influenced the outcome measures and recruitment. Again, co-designing the kind of, or shaping the methodology. Again, participation in committees, I've got cited there some kind of narrative, not narrative, but sentences. So consumers are involved in governance and decision making as well. And then again, allocation of budget for consumer support. I think this is really important. And then ensure accessible communication. So setting the scene, having that that narrative in a plain English language, because I'm not sure, because I'm not into the other day, so probably you can get panelists, so you have to have it in a lay language here. And then we have provide joint training, so researchers and consumers train a collaboration. And then also evaluate consumer involvement. So again, feedback with surveys, what did work out, what didn't, and how can we make it better for the next time? Yeah, so something like that. The other thing I want to ask is to raise is that being on this role made me realize, it was eye-opening, that some of the really, really good application across really provided this element here. But I guess I think at least the ones assigned to me, there were 3 grants that wholly didn't articulate or demonstrate the, consumer kind of thing, involving consumer kind of thing. And then you can just imagine that the 2 pages set for consumer involvement was just like half a page written in half a page. So I said, yeah, so.
Were those the ones, where they said that physicians or clinicians were consumers? Yeah, so that was like the committee got pissed off if they said that consumers.
Yes, I said, oh, really so sorry.
So when they say the consumers, it's all patients, like, or all people with.
Yeah, and like, so it's like, obviously you could have had a clinician if it was like they have a clear role in the impact of that translation into their area of practice. But it was obvious that there was a CI panel and then be like, oh, which one could be the consumer? And then be like, oh, this Bob's a consumer because he works with patients every day.
Yeah.
And then the whole justification was just they've met a patient before that has that, like it was just so tacked on. And then that and not paying them was like, yeah.
So,
So can I just ask a question about payment? I know there's various documents that talk about what hourly rate they should have and things, but yeah, did people assign actual salaries to consumers, or like we often pay in gift cards? Like, what's the current gold standard for payment?
question. So, very good question. So, to answer that straight, there is no standardized rates to be paid for consumers. However, each of Australian states or territories does have their own kind of standardized rates. And so for us, New South Wales, we usually refer them to, or we refer to Consumer Health Forum. And then they've got this document, I can share that to you, but we have this document wherein they articulate kind of how much they pay per hour as to kind of the level of participation the consumer is involved in. So, yeah.
But no one really specified the mode of payment. There was no like, it was just an hourly rate in the budget.
Yeah. Or say, trips or trainings or something like that. Yeah.
Do you have more slides? First?
Yes.
So you might answer my question.
Okay, so some common weaknesses or the expert. Again, providing just a generic or vague involvement statements that lack specifics on consumer inclusion. So some of the things is consumer involvement is a priority for our team. We always aim to include the community in our research. So that doesn't even, yeah. So, and then I think the late consultation, so the lack of input into or influence of consumer into shaping the research question is one thing that I found was a common weakness. Saying we will seek consumer input once the ethics approval has been granted and the protocol finalized. So I was again, this is tokenistic or involvement. So again, minimal engagement or without support. So examples, one consumer will be invited to attend an annual meeting to provide feedback. So, and then it's question mark to me. And then again, this is confusing kind of consumer role. So it blurs consumers with participants. So for example, we will collect feedback from trial participants to ensure consumer perspectives are captured. So again, that's an X. And then lastly, we've got no decision making. So again, consumers are just passive reviewers or a one-time off consultant to the grant. So provided the research team led by senior investigators will determine the study priorities. Consumers may be invited to review some documents. So there's again, so completely okay. So again, my just top tips. I know it's a challenge for some to kind of come up with a genuine consumer involvement statement in grant, but for me, being on this role and to be sitting in that panel, I would recommend that if you do want to have a consumer involvement statement that is, top or excellent, I think we start to involve consumers at the early stage from the very conceptualization, very beginning. We build relationships, not transactions. And as mentioned before, I appreciate those applications who do demonstrate a long-standing relationships with their consumers for the next number of years. And even they kind of have other international consumers involved as well. Again, using plain language so that panels include lay reviewers. And then, of course, you document the involvement of consumers clearly as to who, when, how, what outcomes. Then, of course, allocate time and funding. And lastly, this is important, include consumers in authorship, presentations, and That's really cool. And then I've got some resources and support, that you can go through. So you can use the consumer involvement statement. Of course, there's MRFF guidelines and templates. There's consumer health forum as well, which is a nice resource. There's also a local consumer engagement officers or advocacy group. Specifically this one, this is a nice one, designed by the New South Wales Regional Health Partners. So you can just click on that as well. And then lastly, I'll give that to you as a code, meaningful consumer involvement research for being about people to being with and for people. So that's all.
Oh, I'll ask some questions. So, probably another bit of Maria could jump in with answers, like, if we're gonna get we are gonna put a consumer as a CI in the conceptual phase, right from the outset, which could look like a really good option going for this grant. Would they need any special training to be in that role?
Yes, that's an issue. Yes, yeah. But I think it's part of the process along the research cycle. So initially, once you've got the lived experience, you can approach that person, but it doesn't have to be at the very beginning that she has to be trained to be part of the research. But along the process, in the research cycle, they can be equipped with the necessary trainings needed for them to actually do the actual research.
And then these faculty's done a really good job of actually getting a really good consumer feedback participant group. Is there people that are in mind that could actually step up into that sort of next role of informing research for consumers as part of the leadership group of the research project?
Sorry, I didn't get.
Do you
Too many
mean
words.
people here, John?
Yeah.
Yes, so we do have consumers on our applications as AIs or CIs? AIs, so that's definitely happened and they've been part of the advisory committee and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And as you know, because I email you, we are ever expanding our consumer reference group so we can get diverse opinions and then those people become listed on applications. There was, someone else was listed recently too.
Wow.
Yeah, so, yeah, that's what I was thinking, yeah.
The different group that I work with at the moment, we've just recently had this argument about where does the consumer come in?
Yeah.
And I think you've made it very good argument at the start.
Yeah. And the other thing NHMRC is saying is that it would be good if there's 2 or 3 more involved in the consumer sitting in the research space. Yeah, correct. Yeah, so.
That makes sense, because they all have different perspectives, like.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think if you can recall, or I'm not sure, yeah, so amongst the 18, I think they've kind of strategically put in, say, 1 CI for consumer and then 2 AIs for the consumer. So, yeah. And I guess it goes down to the kind of the degree of participation of consumers, how they would love to be involved, even if the grant is funded. Yes.
I have a question. How was, and this may not have been relevant, but involving a consumer representative body seen? So instead of a person with asthma, involving Asthma Australia, was that seen as good, bad, eh?
I think yes, my straight answer is yes, because
It was seen as good, but that's rated separate, the partner involvement is rated separately.
Okay.
Adult consumers, so you need partners as well as.
Probably
Consumers,
has involved with peak body
Yeah.
and
Was it
you know,
necessarily-
community representation as a group, not
Yeah.
as individuals.
Yeah. So that comes into that dissemination-y element of recycle. Okay.
yeah, kind of, yeah.
But you couldn't just say, oh, I'm involved.
Yeah, we love Asthma Australia.
Yeah, that would be fair enough, that's could be tokenistic as well.
Yeah. Vanessa, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask about the plain language. Could you expand a bit on that, like which parts of the grant should you be writing in plain language versus others, or should it be throughout? Or yeah, what are your thoughts on
I
that?
think just providing overall, say, technical or very scientific language that is hard for people to understand, so explaining it to sort of a very lay kind of narrative would be really good, I think, because to me, when I was, even me, I was just going through those grants and I have to read over and over again for me to, to get what they mean. Yes, I guess using plain language or summary perhaps or definition as to what is that, I think would be good, yeah.
Yeah, so basically making sure anybody could read your whole grant
Yeah,
and not
yeah.
feel like they didn't
Just have to
understand it.
read over and over again and said, okay, this is what they wanted to. Yeah.
I think because of that suitability assessment as well, they really encouraged us to say that to not say that we weren't suitable for any grant, so it had to be like extreme circumstances to say that you couldn't. So like, it was possible that I could do pediatric or basic science, sure, and then, yeah, I agree, there was one that you could tell they knew what they're talking about, but I had to read it like 5 times to be like, actually, what are you doing? And then it just, you know, as you know, when you read something over and over again, it just makes you more angry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And who are on the panel? What are the caliber of people assessing the grants? Are they, as you said, do they have to be some medical background or vary?
It was pretty mixed, hey, I think they on purpose, it looked like they had on purpose tried to mix career stage. So there was probably a third early career who said that never has been on an assessment committee before, and then same a third like senior. And then there was like someone with stats background, someone with bronchiectasis background. You know, like it looked like they kind of really tried to balance it. And then some were discovery scientists, some were clinical, some were actually clinicians.
Yeah.
So there was a real mix. So it felt like anytime a specific point got brought up about a grant, there was at least one person who was like an expert in that area who didn't say their point, but you know, they can't cover all bases obviously, but yeah. And the early career researchers seemed more objective than the seniors.
And was this all done on Zoom? It wasn't face-to-face session?
Yeah. Which is tough too. Yeah. The feedback from people who'd been on the committee before had said it was easier in person. Like they must use it. Yeah, I don't know if you've done it before, but take people to Canberra.
Not in person.
Yeah, and then I can see how that would be more engaging and less fatiguing than being on Zoom all day.
But yeah, I was just sharing my insights to Haley, like personally, NHMRC should come up with a standardized rubric for evolving consumer.
You need to develop one now.
You have already.
You have more on the screen.
But I can just go through these, yeah.
And I feel like Elle will be on every panel going forward because everyone was so pleased with how well she did and how objective it was. That Elle will be a person to ask. Yeah.
And on all the grants too.
Yeah.
Do you get paid to review grants?
You get paid for the meetings, you don't get paid for the time to review.
Which is all the time.
Well done.
That's the easiest bit.
Yeah. So for poor Elle, who reviewed whatever 18 that you did, the financial, compensation.
The trade-off.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're looking for a thematic element throughout the grant, not the overall grant itself, so you've got to read between the lines.
Much harder for poor Elle.
Did you already get?
Yeah, I would actually, yeah. Yeah, it was interesting. And I think you would learn more each time you did it about how to write a good grant.
Yeah, someone told me a couple of years ago that, and I was on a grant, so I had a conflict. So
yeah.
I think it's Kristen.
Yeah, you can nominate yourself to be on the committee, I think.
Yeah, like I
Somewhere
did,
inside.
every now and then things pop up, and I don't remember applying for it, I may well have applied for.
I have a question for Elle.
Yes.
Where in the cycle of involving consumers did most people not do well? Was it mostly at the beginning or during or the translation?
That's a good question. Actually, it's mixed. Yeah, I would say, or like, they would start very good at the very beginning as to having consultation, having these focus groups and all of that. Then they kind of set out how to do it with consumers. So they've got this methodology focus group, and you go back to method section, and they would actually, in the methodology section, they would say, okay, we'll be running focus groups, X number, blah, blah, blah. But then in the, say, in dissemination or in actual analysis, there's no mention. And even say towards the end, wherein consumers will be consulted back again for future research questions or unanswered research questions. No, yeah, so it's a mix, yeah. So, or others would say a low kind of demonstrating at the early stage, conceptualization, but then they come back to, or they would have a very articulate demonstration of involving consumers in methods, then on the analyses, and then the presentation and all of that, and then circling back to gathering unanswered research questions. So there's,
And how would you involve them in the analysis if it's not? I can imagine involving them in the qualitative analysis, but not in the quantity.
yes, that's a very good question. So this is where consumers get to have the kind of the level of participation they do want to be involved in research. So not all consumers can do, say, reviewing. Not consumers would be, good at analyzing or talking or presenting, et cetera, et cetera. But then once, say, in the, I think the research cycle number 3 in actual doing it is if a consumer express they do want to learn something about it, so there's training involved, so that could be taken into account into budgeting or allocations for both researcher and consumers to have these training. So, but if there's should be a training involved, should a consumer express the desire to be actively, analyzing the data at some stage, but yeah, so. Great.